If you could smell the month of August in 1944 in the pastoral fields of Normandy, you would not smell the ripening wheat or the salt air of the Channel. You would smell the sweet, cloying stench of a slaughterhouse left baking in the summer sun, a mixture of 30,000 dead cattle, thousands of unburied men, and the sharp chemical tang of burning diesel fuel that hung over the Falaise pocket like a shroud. To Hauptmann Erich Schröder, commanding a Panther tank of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitler Jugend. This smell was not repulsive. It was the atmosphere of his profession, a sensory reminder that the Third Reich was fighting for its existence in a shrinking cauldron of violence that the maps in Berlin called a tactical withdrawal, but which every man on the ground knew was a desperate flight from annihilation. Schröder stood in the turret of his tank, number 402, watching the dust clouds rising to the north near the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, his eyes narrowed against the glare, his black uniform coated in a layer of grey dust that made him look like a statue carved from ash. He was 24 years old but looked 50, his face hollowed by weeks of ceaseless combat, by the amphetamines that kept him awake for 72 hours at a stretch, and by the cynical hardness that comes from watching your friends burn to death inside steel coffins. He wrote in his diary, a small leather-bound book that would be found 3 weeks later in the charred ruin of his hull, a sentence that encapsulates the fatal arrogance of the German armored elite, even as the noose tightened. The Americans push us from the south with their endless supplies, but to the north it is only the Canadians, the colonials with their toy tanks. We will punch through them like a fist through wet paper. They are not soldiers, they are targets wrapped in thin steel. Schröder believed this because he had been taught to believe it, because the propaganda of the master race insisted that a Canadian farmer in a mass-produced Sherman could never stand against the superior engineering of Krupp and Porsche, could never match the martial spirit of the SS. He did not know, could not let himself know, that the toy tanks he dismissed were carrying men who had long since shed their innocence on the beaches of Juno and the bloody fields of Carpiquet, men who had learned that the only way to kill a tiger is not to wrestle it but to trap it and bleed it dry. 10 kilometers to the north, in the claustrophobic interior of a Sherman Firefly named Alberta's Revenge, Sergeant Arthur Art Mitchell of the South Alberta Regiment was trying to keep his breakfast down while the tank lurched over a sunken road that threatened to throw a track at every turn. Mitchell was a schoolteacher from Lethbridge before the world went mad, a man who loved poetry and silence, but now lived in a world of deafening noise and industrial violence. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a greasy rag, looking at his loader, Private James Jimmy Ross, a kid from Saskatoon who was barely old enough to shave, but could load a 17-pounder shell in 4 seconds flat. The interior of the Sherman was a torture chamber of heat and noise, smelling of oil, cordite, and the unwashed bodies of 5 men living in a steel box. They knew what the Germans called their tanks, Ronsons, because they lit up the first time you hit them. They knew they were driving mobile crematoriums that were outgunned and under-armored compared to the monsters lurking in the hedgerows. But Mitchell also knew something Schröder didn't. He knew they were the cork in the bottle. He knew that the entire German 7th Army was trying to squeeze through a gap that was shrinking by the hour, and that he and his crew were the ones tasked with slamming the door shut. "They're coming, Art," said his driver, Corporal Frederick Fred Campbell, his voice crackling over the intercom, distorted by the static and the roar of the engine. "Recce says the whole damn Wehrmacht is coming down the Dives River Valley." Mitchell looked through his periscope, seeing the peaceful French countryside that was about to become the anvil upon which an army would be broken. "Let them come," Mitchell said, his voice flat, lacking the bravado of the movies. "We have the high ground and we have the ammo. Just don't let the engine stall, Fred. If we stop, we die." The tragedy of the Falaise Gap was not just a military defeat. It was a collision of 2 different worlds, 2 different philosophies of war. On one side, the German belief in the Übermensch, the superior warrior in the superior machine, fighting a Wagnerian battle against the odds. On the other side, the Allied reality of industrial warfare, of logistics, artillery, and the grim methodical application of overwhelming firepower. As the sun reached its zenith on August 18th, the collision began. The first probing attacks by the Germans were not the coordinated panzer wedges of the early war, but desperate, disjointed lunges by mixed battle groups, a few tanks, a half-track full of wounded, a company of infantry desperate to escape the corridor of death. Schroeder's Panther rumbled forward, its 75mm high-velocity gun scanning the tree line. He saw a Sherman sitting brazenly in the open near a bridge crossing, its silhouette unmistakable. "Look at them," Schroeder sneered to his gunner. "They offer themselves to us." He ordered the driver to halt, the gunner to target. The Panther's gun roared, the recoil rocking the 60-ton beast. The shell flew true, slamming into the Sherman's turret. But there was no explosion, no fire. The shell ricocheted off the mantlet with a shower of sparks. It wasn't a standard Sherman. It was a Hulk, a decoy towed into position to draw fire. Before Schroeder could process the deception, the radio crackled with screaming. "Anti-tank fire! From the left! Flank!" The budget Canadians hadn't just parked their tanks. They had dug them in, camouflaged them, created kill zones that utilized every inch of the terrain. A shell from a 17-pounder Firefly, hidden in a barn 300 meters away, slammed into the side armor of the Panther next to Schroeder's. The impact was a dull, sickening thud, followed instantly by a catastrophic cook-off of the ammunition. A pillar of white-hot flame geysered from the commander's hatch, incinerating the crew instantly. Schroeder watched in horror as the man he had shared coffee with that morning was turned into a torch, his screams audible even over the engine noise. The toy tanks were biting back. The realization that the Canadians were not going to move, that they were willing to trade hull for hull to keep the trap closed, began to seep into the consciousness of the German crews like a cold poison. This wasn't a mobile battle of maneuver, it was a siege. The road to St. Lambert became a parking lot of burning German armor. Mitchell, in Alberta's revenge, was working with the cold precision of a man who has accepted his own death. "Loader AP, traversing right," he yelled, watching a German half-track try to bypass the burning Panther. The gunner fired. The half-track disintegrated, throwing bodies into the air like rag dolls. Mitchell didn't feel triumph. He felt a profound, sickening waste. He saw men crawling in the ditch, men missing legs, men holding their intestines, and he ordered the coaxial machine gun to fire. It was mercy, in a way. It was the logic of the gap. If they escaped, they would fight again. If they died here, the war ended sooner. That was the math. But the math didn't account for the eyes of the men you killed. Down in the village, the infantry fighting was devolving into a savage brawl. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada were fighting house to house against SS paratroopers who refused to surrender. It was intimate, brutal work with grenades and bayonets. Our Canadian private, Thomas "Tom" Wilson, kicked open the door of a farmhouse kitchen and found a German officer sitting at the table, calmly eating a piece of cheese while his men fired from the windows upstairs. The surrealism of the moment froze Wilson for a second. The officer looked up, wiped his mouth, and reached for his Luger. Wilson shot him with a Sten gun, the burst stitching him across the chest, knocking him backward, chair and all. The cheese rolled onto the floor, untouched by the blood. "Crazy bastards," Wilson muttered, changing magazines. "They're all crazy." As the afternoon wore on, the pressure on the Canadian lines became immense. The Germans were throwing everything they had at the blockade. King Tigers, Jagd Panthers, stolen trucks, horse-drawn carts. It was a chaotic flood of humanity trying to push through a pinhole. Hauptmann Schroeder, his own tank now damaged, its optics shattered by shrapnel, was forced to command with his head out of the hatch, exposed to the swarm of mosquitoes and bullets. He saw the destruction of his company, piece by piece. He saw Untersturmführer Braun's Tiger hit by artillery, the massive turret blown clean off the hull. He saw the infantry, the Lanzer, being mowed down by Canadian artillery that was now falling with terrifying accuracy, guided by spotter planes that circled overhead like vultures. The budget army had a radio network that worked. They had batteries of 25-pounders that could drop a curtain of steel anywhere within minutes. Schroeder realized with a sinking heart that the technology of the tank was irrelevant if the sky belonged to the enemy. He grabbed his microphone, shouting over the din, "All units, push, push, or we die here. There is no reverse." But the push was stalling. The road was blocked by the wreckage of the vanguard. The Canadians had created a dam of steel and fire. Inside Alberta's Revenge, the air was foul with cordite fumes that made the eyes water and the throat burn. Jimmy Ross, the loader, was slipping on the brass casings that littered the floor. "We're running low on AP, Sarge," he yelled. Mitchell checked his watch. They had been fighting for 6 hours without a break. "Use the HE on the tracks if you have to. Just keep shooting." He looked out the periscope and saw something that made his blood run cold. A king tiger, the 70-ton Leviathan, was lumbering out of the smoke, its long 80-meter gun swinging toward them. It was a mismatch of epic proportions. The Sherman's armor was barely enough to stop a heavy machine gun. The king tiger's front plate was impervious to almost anything. "Driver, reverse! Get us hull down!" Mitchell screamed. The Sherman jerked backward, the tracks spinning in the mud. The king tiger fired. The shell passed so close to their turret that the air pressure popped Mitchell's ears. The sonic cracked like a whip snap inside his skull. It hit the stone wall behind them, showering the tank with debris. "Flank him, we have to flank him," Mitchell yelled. But they couldn't move, they were boxed in by the terrain, they were dead. Mitchell closed his eyes, waiting for the second shot, the one that doesn't miss. But the shot never came. A Typhoon fighter bomber, diving out of the sun like a silver hawk, unleashed a salvo of rockets. They struck the King Tiger on the engine deck, the thin armor there offering no protection. The tank disappeared in a massive fireball, the ammunition exploding with such force that it shook the ground under Mitchell's tracks. The budget army had called in the cavalry. By evening, the gap had not closed, but it had become a river of blood. The Dives River ran red, literally, choked with the bodies of men and horses. The Germans called it Der Kessel, the cauldron. Schroeder, abandoning his disabled tank, was now on foot, leading a group of survivors through the woods. He had lost his arrogance. He had lost his certainty. He was just a man trying to walk east. He looked at the faces of his men, dazed, deafened, broken. They passed a clearing where a Canadian Sherman crew was taking prisoners. He saw the Canadians giving water to the Germans, sharing cigarettes. It confused him. Moments ago they were killing each other with industrial efficiency. Now they were just men again. He realized that the propaganda had lied about more than just the tanks. It had lied about the nature of the enemy. These weren't soulless colonials. They were workmen who had finished a job. But the job wasn't finished. The night was falling, and with the darkness came the true horror. The artillery didn't stop. The Canadian guns kept firing, walking barrages back and forth across the escape routes, churning the earth and the dead into a singular, grotesque paste. Mitchell finally pulled off the line for a resupply, sat on the back deck of his tank, eating cold bully beef from a tin. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the spoon. He looked at the fires burning in the distance, the funeral pyres of the 7th Army. "We stopped them, Art," said Fred Campbell, sitting beside him, lighting a cigarette. "We actually stopped them." Mitchell nodded, chewing slowly, tasting the metallic tang of the meat and the war. "Yeah," he whispered, "we stopped them, but God help us for how we did it." The irony of the budget Shermans was fully realized in the wreckage that littered the St. Lambert Road. The cheap, mass-produced tanks had taken losses, yes, they had burned. But there were always more of them. For every Sherman Schroeder's company destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every Tiger the Germans lost, there was no replacement. It was a victory of economics as much as courage. But to the men inside, it didn't feel like economics. It felt like a miracle. Mitchell touched the side of his tank, the warm steel that had been his home and his coffin for months. It was ugly, it was tall, it was thinly armored. But it was here, and the Tigers were burning. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the gap into a twilight of traces and explosions. The single morning of confidence had turned into the long night of the Falaise pocket. And the German crews, those who were left, weren't saying anything anymore. They were screaming, or they were silent forever. The trap was shutting and the fingers closing it wore Canadian maple leaves. The psychological toll on the Canadians was different, but just as heavy. They were the executioners of an army that refused to die. They had to kill and kill until there was no one left to shoot. It was a grim burden. Private Wilson, cleaning his Sten gun in a barn, found a letter in the pocket of the officer he had killed. It was in German, but he recognized the word Mutti, Mom. He stared at it for a long time, the ink smeared with blood. He folded it up and put it in his pocket, next to his own letter from his mother in Winnipeg. Two mothers, thousands of miles apart, waiting for sons who had met in a French kitchen. One would get a letter, the other would get a telegram. Wilson blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, but sleep would not come. The sound of the artillery was a heartbeat, a rhythmic thumping that reminded everyone that the harvest was not yet over. The gap was closing, but the cost of the closure was being paid in souls. The night of August 18th did not bring darkness to the Falaise pocket. It brought a strobe light horror show of flares, tracers, and the burning wrecks of 1,000 vehicles that illuminated the slaughter with a flickering, sickly orange glow. For Hauptmann Erich Schröder, now leading a ragtag group of survivors on foot through the wooded hills near Chambouis, the night was a cloak that offered no hiding place. Every step was a gamble against the Canadian artillery that was now zoning the escape routes, dropping shells in unpredictable patterns designed to catch moving infantry in the open. The air was thick with the screams of wounded horses, thousands of them, conscripted by the Wehrmacht as fuel ran out, now wandering the battlefield with their guts trailing or their legs shattered, their cries sounding disturbingly human in the dark. Schröder stumbled over something soft in the ditch and realized with a jolt of nausea that it was a woman, a French refugee caught in the crossfire, her cart of belongings scattered across the road like the debris of a shipwreck. He didn't stop. Compassion was a luxury he had discarded kilometers ago. His only mission now was survival, to reach the far bank of the Dives River before the Canadians sealed the last exit. He looked at his men, gaunt spectres in torn uniforms, eyes wide and glistening in the firelight, clutching their rifles like talismans. They were the Herrenvolk, the master race, reduced to scavengers picking their way through the ruins of their own hubris. "Keep moving," he hissed, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't look at the dead. Look at the feet of the man in front of you. That is your world now." Meanwhile, inside the Canadian lines, the mood was a tense, vibrating wire of exhaustion and adrenaline. Sergeant Arthur "Art" Mitchell sat in the commander's hatch of Alberta's Revenge, forcing himself to stay awake by chewing coffee grounds straight from the ration tin. The bitterness coated his tongue, fighting the taste of vomit that threatened to rise every time the wind shifted from the direction of the killing fields. His tank was parked in a hull-down position overlooking a crucial crossroads, the engine idling to keep the battery charged, a low rumble that vibrated through his bones. His crew was asleep inside, slumped in awkward angles against the ammo racks, snatching minutes of unconsciousness before the next attack. Mitchell scanned the dark tree line with his binoculars, watching the phantom shapes of the enemy moving in the gloom. He wasn't thinking about strategy or the big picture. He was thinking about the letter he had started writing to his wife, Mary, 3 days ago. A letter he couldn't finish because he didn't know how to tell her that the man she married was gone, replaced by a mechanic of death who calculated angles of incidence and armor penetration instead of reading poetry. He saw movement, a shadow detaching itself from the darker shadows of the woods. "Wake up!" He kicked the gunner's shoulder gently. "Movement. 12 o'clock. Infantry." The turret whirred to life, the noise waking the rest of the crew instantly. They didn't ask questions. They just moved to their stations with the muscle memory of men who had done this 1,000 times. The attack came not as a wave, but as a desperate surge of individuals. A group of SS soldiers, cut off and frantic, charged the crossroads with MP40s and grenades, screaming unintelligible curses. Mitchell ordered the coaxial machine gun to fire. The tracers lashed out, bright red lines connecting the tank to the men, cutting them down before they could get within throwing range. It wasn't a battle, it was pest control. One German managed to get close, hurling a potato masher grenade that exploded harmlessly against the Sherman's glacis plate, scratching the paint. He was cut in half a second later by the bow gunner. Silence returned to the crossroads, broken only by the groans of the dying. Mitchell dropped back into the turret, rubbing his eyes. "Christ, Art," Jimmy Ross whispered from the loader's seat. "They just don't stop." "They can't stop, Jimmy," Mitchell replied softly. "They have nowhere to go." That was the reality of the pocket. It was a pressure cooker with no relief valve. The Germans were being squeezed until they burst. By the morning of August 19th, the budget Shermans were proving their worth in a way the German commanders had never anticipated. They were reliable. While the Panthers and Tigers were abandoned by the roadside with broken final drives or empty fuel tanks, the Shermans kept running. They were ugly, they were noisy, but they were there. Major David Curry, commanding a battle group of the South Alberta Regiment in St. Lambert, was orchestrating a masterclass in defensive warfare. With a handful of tanks and fewer than 200 men, he was holding back the flood of the 7th Army. He moved his tanks constantly, creating the illusion of a much larger force, plugging gaps as soon as they appeared. He was everywhere at once, on foot, in his tank, directing artillery, calming terrified men. He saw a German convoy trying to sneak through the village under the cover of morning mist. Trucks, staff cars, half-tracks, all jammed bumper to bumper. Curry didn't wait. He ordered his lead tank to fire a high-explosive shell into the lead truck. The explosion blocked the road instantly. Then he called in the artillery. The result was a massacre so complete it defied description. Vehicles burned, ammunition cooked off, and men were incinerated where they sat. A German general, caught in the jam, stepped out of his staff car, looked at the carnage, straightened his uniform, and shot himself in the head. Curry watched it through his binoculars, feeling a strange detachment. It was like watching a film reel that had jammed and was burning in the projector. Schroeder and his group had managed to slip through the lines during the night, wading across the Dives River with their weapons held high, the water red and thick with debris. They were now in the corridor of death, a narrow strip of land between St. Lambert and Chambois that was still technically open, but swept by fire from both sides. They found an abandoned farmhouse and collapsed inside, too exhausted to speak. Schroeder found a bottle of wine in a cupboard and uncorked it, passing it around. They drank in silence, the red liquid staining their lips like blood. "What now, Hauptmann?" asked a young corporal, his face a mask of soot. Schroeder looked at the map, which was now useless. "We walk east," he said, "until we find a unit that is still fighting, or until we die." He didn't tell them that he had lost faith in the fighting. He didn't tell them that he envied the dead general. He just drank the wine and listened to the artillery getting closer. Outside, the sky was filled with typhoons again, diving on anything that moved. The sound of their rockets was a terrifying tearing noise, like canvas ripping. Schroeder went to the window and saw a column of horse-drawn artillery being annihilated on the road. The horses reared and screamed as the rockets hit, turning the convoy into a grotesque sculpture of meat and wood. He turned away, sickened. This wasn't war. This was the industrial processing of meat. Back at the crossroads, Mitchell's crew was having breakfast, cold beans and hardtack. They were interrupted by a surreal sight. A German soldier walked out of the woods, waving a white handkerchief. He was followed by another and another. Soon a stream of men, hundreds of them, were emerging from the tree line, hands on their heads. They were filthy, starving, and beaten. They were the supermen of the Reich, now just broken men looking for a cage and a meal. Mitchell stood on the turret, watching them file past. He saw the relief in their eyes. They were safe. The war was over for them. He felt a pang of jealousy. They were going to a POW camp in Canada or England, where they would sleep in beds and eat 3 meals a day. He was staying here, in the box. "Look at 'em," Fred Campbell spat. "Arrogant bastards. Bet they don't look so tough now." Mitchell shook his head. "They look like us, Fred, just tired." He ordered Jimmy to toss them a pack of cigarettes. The Germans scrambled for them in the dirt, fighting like dogs. It was pathetic. It was human. Mitchell watched a young German boy, maybe 16, light a cigarette with trembling hands and inhale deeply, closing his eyes in ecstasy. For a moment, the war didn't exist, just the tobacco and the smoke. Then, a mortar shell landed in the middle of the group. The explosion was a sudden, violent punctuation mark. Bodies flew. The peace was shattered. The Canadians dove into their hatches. The prisoners scattered like frightened sheep. It was friendly fire, a Canadian mortar team miscalculating the range. Mitchell cursed, slamming his hatch shut. "Check fire! Check fire!" he screamed into the radio. But the damage was done. The boy with the cigarette was gone, replaced by a smear of red on the road. The randomness of it all was what broke you. You could survive the Tiger tank only to be killed by your own side while surrendering. It was a cosmic joke without a punchline. Mitchell sat in the darkness of the turret, listening to the shrapnel pinging off the hull, and felt a tear slide down his cheek. He wiped it away angrily. There was no time for tears. The gap wasn't closed yet. As the sun climbed higher, the heat returned, intensifying the smell of death. The flies were everywhere now, millions of them, a buzzing black cloud that covered the dead and tormented the living. They crawled into eyes, into mouths, into open wounds. Schroeder, moving his men again, spent half his energy swatting them away. They were walking through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and grey. They came across a Panther tank sitting intact in a field. The engine was running. Schroeder climbed up and looked inside. The crew was dead, not a mark on them. Concussion? Gas? Suicide? He couldn't tell. The radio was still squawking, voices screaming for help, for ammo, for orders. Schroeder reached down and turned it off. The silence was sudden and heavy. He sat on the turret of the dead tank, looking at the devastation around him. He realized then that the budget Shermans hadn't just defeated them with numbers. They had defeated them with persistence. They were the tortoise to the German hare, and the hare was now dead in a ditch. He climbed down, patted the cold steel of the Panther, and walked away. He was leaving behind the myth of German armor superiority. He was leaving behind his youth. He was walking into a future where he would have to explain this to his children, and he knew he would never find the words. The single morning was over. The long afternoon of defeat had begun, and the Canadians were still watching from the hills, their toy tanks ready to fire. By the afternoon of August 19th, the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive had ceased to be a geographical location on a map of France and had transformed into a singularity of violence, a black hole where the physics of civilized existence collapsed under the weight of desperate men and grinding steel. The budget Shermans of the South Alberta Regiment, those mass-produced thin-skinned tractors of war that the German propaganda machine had derided as Tommy Cookers, were now the only thing standing between the remnants of the 7th Army and their salvation, and they were holding the line with a stubborn, mechanical resilience that baffled the German commanders who were throwing wave after wave of elite infantry against them. Hauptmann Erich Schroeder, lying flat in a ditch filled with nettles and empty ammunition crates 300 meters from the Canadian perimeter, watched through the haze of heat and smoke as a squad of Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers who were supposed to be the toughest men in the Wehrmacht, tried to assault a lone Sherman parked near the village church. It was a spectacle of futile bravery. The paratroopers moved with the fluid grace of veterans, using the rubble for cover, darting from shadow to shadow, but the Sherman, commanded by a Corporal Schroeder would never know, didn't panic, didn't retreat, and didn't maneuver. It simply sat there, its turret rotating with a slow hydraulic whine, its coaxial machine gun dispensing death with the indifference of a vending machine. Schroeder saw 3 men cut down in a single burst, their bodies jerking violently as the 32-06 rounds tore through their jump smocks, turning them into heaps of grey cloth and bloody meat. The tank didn't even bother to fire its main gun. It was conserving ammunition, treating the elite German assault as a nuisance rather than a threat. To Schroeder, this was the ultimate insult, the final proof that the war was lost not because of betrayal or strategy, but because the enemy treated killing the Übermensch as a mundane chore, a job to be finished before lunch. He looked at his own pistol, a finely machined Walter P-38, a piece of engineering art. And then he looked at the Sherman, a welded box of American steel commanded by a Canadian farm boy, and he realized that the age of the warrior was dead, replaced by the age of the mechanic. Inside Alberta's Revenge, the atmosphere was a toxic stew of sweat, cordite fumes, and the acrid smell of fear that no amount of ventilation could clear. Sergeant Arthur Art Mitchell had stopped shouting orders. His voice was gone, reduced to a croak that barely registered over the intercom. He communicated now with kicks and hand signals, a primitive language of survival developed in the womb of the tank. They were low on everything, low on fuel, low on armor-piercing shells, low on water, and dangerously low on hope, but they were still firing. Mitchell watched through his periscope as a German half-track packed with wounded men tried to run the gauntlet of the main road, the driver weaving desperately through the craters. It was a mercy target, a vehicle that posed no threat, but Mitchell knew the rules of the gap. Nothing moves. If they let the wounded through, the tanks would follow. If they let the tanks through, the war would drag on for another year. He tapped his gunner on the shoulder and pointed. The turret swung. The gun fired. The shell hit the half-track's engine block, flipping the vehicle onto its side, spilling its cargo of broken men onto the asphalt. Mitchell didn't watch the aftermath. He traversed the turret back to the right, scanning for the next target. He felt a profound, hollowing numbness spreading through his chest, a sense that he was carving away pieces of his own soul with every pull of the trigger. "God forgive us," he whispered, the words lost in the roar of the engine. "God forgive us for what we have to do to stop them." But God was absent from St. Lambert that day. There was only Major David Curry, walking calmly through the mortar fire with his pistol in his hand, tapping on the hulls of his tanks, directing their fire, a man who seemed to have made a private pact with death that rendered him immune to fear. Curry's presence was the spine that held the Canadian defense together. When a crew wavered, terrified by the tigers prowling the woods, they saw their major standing in the open, lighting a cigarette while shrapnel zipped past his head, and they were shamed back into their duty. The corridor of death was narrowing by the minute. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, fighting on the high ground of Mczuga, the Mace, was hammering the Germans from the north, pushing them down into the valley where the Canadians were waiting. The compression of the pocket created a scene of horror that surpassed the worst nightmares of Dante. The roads were blocked not by traffic jams, but by walls of burning wreckage that fused together into barricades of twisted metal and charred flesh. Horses, mad with terror, galloped through the inferno, trampling the wounded until they too were cut down by shrapnel, adding their massive carcasses to the piles of debris. Schroeder, forced to abandon his position by the creeping barrage of Canadian artillery, led his small group of survivors deeper into the woods, trying to find a crossing point over the Dives River that wasn't choked with bodies. They moved like sleepwalkers, stumbling over roots and corpses, their senses overloaded to the point of shutdown. They came across a clearing where a German field hospital had been set up, now abandoned by the doctors. The wounded lay on stretchers in the open, hundreds of them begging for water, for morphine, for death. Schroeder stopped, paralyzed by the scale of the suffering. A young soldier, his legs gone, looked up at Schroeder and asked, "Herr Hauptmann, are the tanks coming? Are the tigers coming to save us?" Schroeder looked down at the boy, looked at the flies crawling on his bandages, and shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "There are no tigers. There is only the end." He walked on, leaving the boy to the mercy of the Canadians, knowing that the budget army would likely treat him better than his own high command, which had sacrificed him for a line on a map. As twilight began to settle over the valley, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of purple and bruised red, the Germans launched their final desperate breakout attempt. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a human stampede. A mixed column of SS tanks, paratroopers, and desperate infantry coalesced near Chambois, and threw themselves at the Canadian lines with the frenzy of trapped animals. The ground shook as the few remaining panthers and tigers roared forward, their engines screaming, trying to punch a hole through the ring of Shermans. Mitchell saw them coming. He saw the muzzle flashes in the twilight, the tracer rounds arching towards his position like angry fireflies. "This is it, boys," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Load he, range 400, fire at will." The budget Shermans unleashed a wall of fire. They didn't aim for the heavy armor of the tigers, they aimed for the tracks, for the optics, for the infantry swarming around them. They used the sheer volume of their fire to blind and deafen the enemy. A panther, hit repeatedly by high-explosive shells, lost a track and spun into a ditch, exposing its thin belly armor. "Hit him! Hit him now!" Mitchell screamed. Jimmy Ross slammed an AP shell into the breach. The gun fired. The panther exploded, its turret blowing 50 feet into the air. But there were too many of them. The German infantry was infiltrating the Canadian positions, swarming over the hedgerows. Mitchell heard the thump of something landing on his engine deck. "Grenade! Rear!" he screamed. He popped his hatch, grabbing his Sten gun, and sprayed the back of the tank, killing a German soldier who was trying to pry open the engine grates. The man slid off the tank, dead before he hit the ground. It was fighting at zero range, tank against man, steel against flesh, The darkness did not bring an end to the fighting. It only made it more terrifying. The battlefield was illuminated by the burning wrecks, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons. The smell was overpowering now. Roast pork, diesel, and excrement, a sensory assault that made men vomit inside their gas masks. Schroeder, caught in the middle of the breakout, found himself pinned down in a crater with a Canadian soldier he had stumbled upon in the dark. They grappled in the mud, rolling over the debris, hands searching for throats, for eyes, for rocks. Schroeder felt the Canadian's hands around his neck, felt the thumbs pressing into his windpipe, the world narrowing to a pinprick of light. He fumbled for his knife, pulled it from his boot, and drove it into the man's side, again and again, feeling the hot blood wash over his hand. The Canadian's grip loosened. He gasped, a wet, gurgling sound, and slumped forward onto Schroeder's chest. Schroeder pushed the body away, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He lay there in the mud, next to the man he had just killed, and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just a cold, empty void where his humanity used to be. He looked at the dead Canadian's face, illuminated by a nearby flare. He was just a kid, maybe 20. Just like the boy in the hospital. Just like Schroeder used to be. He realized then that they were all just meat waiting to be processed by the machine. The budget Shermans weren't fighting the Germans anymore. The machine was fighting everyone. At the bridge in St. Lambert, Major Curry was still standing. He had been awake for 3 days. His uniform was black with soot. He had personally directed the destruction of 7 tanks, 12 anti-tank guns, and 40 vehicles. He watched as the last surge of the German breakout broke against his line like a wave against a cliff. The Germans were surrendering in droves now, realizing that the toy tanks were not going to move. They walked out of the smoke with their hands up, thousands of them, weeping, laughing, staring blankly. Mitchell, watching from his turret, felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like paralysis. He slumped back into his seat, letting the adrenaline drain away. "We held them, Art," Fred Campbell whispered over the intercom. "We held the bastard gap." Mitchell nodded, closing his eyes. He could hear the moans of the wounded outside, a chorus of misery that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He thought of the budget Shermans, those ugly, mass-produced boxes. They had done what the Tigers couldn't. They had survived. They had endured. They had won not by being better, but by being there, immovable and relentless, a reflection of the men inside them. The gap was closed. The 7th Army was dead. But as Mitchell listened to the silence settling over the battlefield, a silence heavy with the presence of 30,000 dead men, he knew that the cost of closing the door had been the loss of everything that made them human. They were just mechanics now, mechanics in a slaughterhouse that had finally run out of cattle.